Hello, happy St. Patrick's Day. I got my green on. Luckiest school nurse ever by the fantastic Lindsay Bell. And my beautiful earrings by Minnie Z. I just wanted you guys to know that the school nurse mascot, Azul, is home with me for the time being. He's doing okay. Anyway, today's reading, let me get cozy here. I'm trying to do super extra. If I can't put you there, you won't be able to hear me. In a minute. I get it. I'm just going to be a little crooked. So for today's reading, boys and girls. You know what's funny about that? Well, this hat hair is not funny. What's funny about that is I talk like that and I'm ridiculous. And my 17-year-old daughter is over there and it doesn't even faze her. So yeah, not only am I weird at school, I'm also weird at home. Speaking of school, I found this book at school. I was like, oh my gosh, I gotta read this one. The School Nurse from the Black Lagoon by Mike Thaler. Pictures by Jared Lee. Oh, look, if I were a puppy, I would be that guy. Here we go. There's supposed to be a nurse at school. And I don't know how to turn pages. I am just having a terrible time right now. Okay, here. No one's ever seen her. At least no one that's ever come back. They say her office is behind the principal's. Her name is Miss Hurst the nurse, and she's supposed to be a real ghoul. Where does it hurt? Still not phased. All around her office are supposed to be dripping color pictures and see-through statues of body parts, eyeballs on rubber bands, heads filled with brains, and bodies stuffed with everything else. She's also supposed to have a skeleton hanging in the corner. They say it's a kid who went there with a stomach ache. She cured it. She never leaves her office. She must eat her lunch there. They say she's always ready for an emergency. Once a kid got cut in half using the paper cutter. Go home. Thanks. Something's wacko. She put the Band-Aid on his back to put him back together. Another kid got run over by the VCR cart and was flattened. He's now the rug in her office. You don't go there unless you're really sick, and she knows if you're faking. She has a thermometer the size of a flagpole. It can read the temperature in your toenails. Keep it under your tongue. She has a tongue depressor as big as surfboards, so you should only go there with major afflictions. Say ah. Then there are tests. She measures your height against a wall chart. If you're too short, she stretches you on the rack until you reach the line. I'm taller! Then you have the eye chart. If you can't see the big E, she uses your eyeballs for billiard balls. Those are pool balls, but also called billiard balls. After that, there's a hearing test. Can you hear me? If you don't pass, she just puts your ears in her jewelry collection. Next, there's the vaccination. Her needle is so long, she can vaccinate 6 kids at once. It's sort of like a shish kebab. Ouch! And there's always the ice. If you fall down, she puts you in her freezer. Some kids take all summer to thaw out. There's also the cot. The mattress filled with bricks and pillow is filled with rocks. The blanket is made out of sandpaper. On the first day of school, Penny Weber went there for a nap. She has straightened out since. Eric Porter went there with a toothache. Now we call him Gums. Y'all know how Nurse Kelli likes pulling teeth. Freddie Jones went there with a sore throat. Now his head is attached directly to his shoulders. She just done cut that throat out of there. Uh-oh, I'm breaking out in blue dots. They're all over my hand. I must have leprosy. My hand will fall off. I'd better go to the school nurse. I walk into her office. Freddie Jones is taking a nap. Either that or he's dead. Miss Hurst is sitting at her desk. She looks pretty normal. Hello. I show her my hand. She wets a paper towel and gently rubs. The blue dots disappear. How's that? She asks to see my pen. I take it out of my pocket. She shows me where it's leaking. She smiles and gives me a new one. Cool. She is a miracle worker. I am cured. She pats me on the head and tells me to visit any time. I go back to class and write her a thank you letter with my new pen. I hope you all don't think I'm that scary. Okay, chapter 2, Mrs. Pickle Wiggle. This is the Thought You Setter's Cure. Mr. Burbank absently reached from behind his newspaper for the sugar bowl. His groping fingers hit the toast, the honeycomb, the salt cellar, and finally found the sugar bowl. His children, Darcy, Allison, and Bard, nudged each other and laughed. Every morning, Daddy felt around on the table for the sugar while he read bad news in the newspaper. One morning, the news was so bad and he was so absent-minded, he put currant jelly in his coffee. The children were anxious for a repeat performance and hopefully pushed everything but the sugar in the path of his searching hand. This morning, as soon as Mr. Burbank had found the sugar, he let the paper down with a bang. "The sugar bowl is empty," he said in an aggrieved, hurtful way. Mrs. Burbank, who was buttering toast, said, "Darcy, run out to the kitchen and fill the sugar bowl, dear. The sugar's in the big red can." Darcy obediently got up, took the sugar bowl, and went out to the kitchen. After a long time, he came back to the breakfast table with a plate of cinnamon rolls. "What are these for?" his father said. "And where is the sugar?" "Sugar?" said Darcy. "What about sugar?" "I told you to fill the sugar bowl," said Mrs. Burbank. "Oh," said Darcy. "I thought you said get the cinnamon roll." All three children looked at each other and laughed loudly. Finally, Mr. and Mrs. Burbank laughed too. Darcy went outside and filled the sugar bowl. Darcy went out to the kitchen and filled the sugar bowl, and Mr. Burbank, after 3 cups of coffee, missed his bus and decided to walk as far as the school with children. Just as they were out the front door, Allison remembered her arithmetic book and dashed upstairs for it. In a minute, she leaned over the banister and called, "Mother, did you see my arithmetic book?" Mrs. Burbank said, "What does it look like?" Allison said, "It's blue and not very thick." Mrs. Burbank said, "I think it's on the table in the hall." Allison said, "How'd it get out there?" Mrs. Burbank said, "Out where? I said it's on the table in the hall." Allison said, "Oh, I thought you said it's out in the stable in a stall." All 3 children roared with laughter. Allison found her arithmetic book, and they all left the house laughing and repeating, "Out in the stable in a stall." Mr. Burbank said, come on, we haven't all day." He walked briskly along the street, his footsteps ringing loudly and purposefully in the thin autumn air. The children giggled and jostled along behind them. their progress so uneven and broken by "thought you said" and shrieks of laughter that Mr. Burbank reached the corner first. In fact, almost before they had left the yard. He stopped to wait for them and to survey the city spread out below him in the morning sunshine. He was glad he lived on a hill. He was glad he was alive, and he was glad he had a little boy 9, a little girl 7, and a little boy 6. When the children caught up with him, he said, "Look, children, see how beautiful the city looks from up here? Watch for the fog to rise over there." "Where's the dog?" said Bard. "What dog?" asked Darcy. "What color are the dog's eyes?" asked Allison. "What on earth are you talking about?" said Mr. Burbank. "I said watch the fog rise over there." "Ew," Bard said. "I thought you said watch the dog's eyes glare." All the children laughed and laughed. Mr. Burbank said, "What nonsense." But it was a beautiful morning, so he laughed with his light-hearted children. When they were halfway down the next block, the children suddenly stopped stock still in front of a pretty white house and yelled in unison, "Maryland! Maryland! Come on, we'll be late." Mr. Burbank said, "That's not the way to do it. If you want Marilyn, go to the door and ask for her." The children looked surprised, but went obediently up to the door and rang the bell. Marilyn's mother opened the door and said something to the children, which seemed to send them into convulsions of mirth. Doubled over with laughter and holding their sides, they came down to walk to their father. "Now, what's so funny?" Mr. Burbank asked. Darcy said, "Marilyn's mother said Marilyn fell in the toaster and burned up dead." Mr. Burbank said, "What did Marilyn's mother really say? And why isn't Marilyn going to school today?" Allison said, "She said Marilyn fell in her coaster and hurt her head, and Darcy thought she said Marilyn fell in the toaster is burned up dead." She went into another paroxysm of laughter. Mr. Burbank didn't laugh. Instead, he bent down, examined Darcy's ears, which were large and pink and soft and quite clean. "They should work," said Mr. Burbank, looking at the other children's ears. They all seemed quite normal. The children wanted to know what he was doing. Bard said, "What are you doing that for, Daddy?" Mr. Burbank said, "I'm trying to decide whether I should get you an ear trumpet." "Beer crumpet? What's that?" Bard said. The other children repeated after him, "Beer crumpet?" They all laughed, but Mr. Burbank, who had had enough, said, "Come on, I'll supervise a race to the school. On your marks, get set, go." When Mr. Burbank reached his office, the very first thing he did was call Mrs. Burbank. He said, "Mary, have our children ever had scarlet fever?" She said, "Now, you know they haven't had that, Bernard." "Well," he said, "have they ever had ear infections?" "Goodness, no. They've never had anything. They're the healthiest children in the neighborhood. What's the matter?" Mr. Burbank said, "Plenty. They can't get any of them to hear well. I told them to look at the fog rise, and they thought I was talking about dog's eyes. Marilyn's mother said that Marilyn fell off her coaster and hurt her head, and they thought she said Marilyn fell on the toaster and was burned up dead." Mrs. Burbank finished for him. "Bernard, did you ever hear of anyone falling in a toaster? Of course not. There is nothing wrong with our children's ears. It's just that they are going through that awful thought you said phase." "Well, let's get them out of it," said Mr. Burbank. "They sound like dopes. Dog's eyes, indeed." Mrs. Burbank said, "Don't worry, dear. I'll take care of it." As soon as she finished talking to Mr. Burbank, Mrs. Burbank called Marilyn's mother to find out about Marilyn, if she was badly hurt, and if there was anything she could do. Marilyn's mother said that Marilyn was just fine, but the doctor thought she should be quiet for a day or two. When Mrs. Burbank asked Marilyn's mother if she had ever had any trouble with the thought you said, and told her about the sugar bowl and the cinnamon rolls, the arithmetic book and the stable stall, about Marilyn's fall and the toaster and the dog's eyes, Marilyn's mother said, "Oh, Mrs. Burbank, I'm so glad you called and told me all this. You see, Marilyn has been doing the same thing all morning, and I was terribly afraid that the blow on her head had affected her mind. But when I asked her if she wanted crumpets or toast, she said, 'Bumped on the nose.' Who? When I asked her if her head pained her, she said, 'I thought you said, is the bed painted yet?'" Mrs. Burbank said, "I'm going to call up Mrs. Teagle and see if Terry or Teresa are thought you saiders. She is such a good manager that if they had the thought you said it, she'd probably thought of a cure." Marilyn's mother asked Mrs. Burbank to call her back if she got any useful information, and then they said goodbye. Holy moly. It's a long chapter. Then Mrs. Burbank called Mrs. Teagle. She told her all about the thought you said itis, and asked if she'd had any similar experience with Terry or Teresa. Mrs. Teagle said, "Oh, now, Mrs. Burbank, you see, we always study correct speech, and we all speak correctly. The children always pronounce all the vowels and all the consonants, and therefore we never have any trouble understanding each other. Perhaps the trouble lies with you, Mr. Burbank. Perhaps you do not speak distinctly. Perhaps the poor little children cannot understand you. I'm holding a little speech classes every afternoon, and if you and Mr. Burbank are interested, I would be glad to have you attend. I wouldn't care to have the children because I'm afraid they might corrupt my children's perfect speech." That's really how she talked. Mrs. Burbank thanked Mrs. Teagle for her kind offer and told her that perhaps she was right, that she said that she and Mr. Burbank would try to speak more distinctly, and if things didn't improve within the week, then they might join them in speech classes. Mrs. Teagle said, "Glad to be of help any time, Mrs. Burbank," and hung up. That night, when Mr. Burbank came home, she told him about calling Mrs. Teagle and told him that she thought from now on they both should try to speak more carefully so their poor little children could understand them. That night at dinner, Mr. Burbank announced in a very loud voice, "Please pass the butter." The children all exchanged glances and whispers, then laughed. The butter remained cool and comfortable on its little plate in front of Darcy. Mr. Burbank looked accusingly at Mrs. Burbank. She said in a high, unnatural voice, "Children, listen to me. Please pass your father the butter." "Oh," said Darcy. "Did you say pass the butter?" "I thought you said fleas, gasp, and mutter." Allison said, "I thought you said he's Pa's mother." And Bard, he said, "I thought you said freeze Pat's brother." Mr. Burbank said in a low, grim voice, "I said, please pass the butter." The next morning after breakfast, Mr. Burbank called from upstairs, "Where's my briefcase? Has anybody seen my briefcase?" Allison said, "Who's got a thief face?" Darcy said, "Beef paste? What do you want that for?" Bard said, "Leaf race. I thought he said leaf race." They all laughed loudly and did not look for the briefcase. They could hear their mother and father banging doors and scuffling around upstairs, but they were so busy, thought you setting, they didn't even notice that Bard was standing in front of the briefcase, which was leaning against the radiator in the front hall. Finally, Mr. Burbank came running downstairs, wild-eyed and almost too late for his bus. He called to Mrs. Burbank, "If you find it, dear, bring it down to the office. I must have it this morning." He slammed the front door and ran like the wind for his bus. Mrs. Burbank was giving the children their final inspection before school when she saw the briefcase leaning against the wall right behind Bard's fat little legs. She said, "Why, children, why didn't you tell Daddy his briefcase was down here? You must have seen it. Now I'll have to make a special trip all the way down to take it to him." "Why didn't you tell him?" She looked sternly at her three children. Allison said, "Briefcase? I didn't know that's what he wanted. I thought he said thief's face." Darcy said, "I didn't know he wanted his briefcase. I thought he said beef paste." And Bard's like, "I thought he said leaf race." Mrs. Burbank said, "You know perfectly well that Daddy wouldn't talk about a thief's face, beef paste, or leaf races. That's just nonsense, and I'm getting good and tired of all this thought you said business." She sent them to school with a little push and without a kiss. But the thought you said-itis continued all the rest of the week. By Friday morning, Mr. and Mrs. Burbank were so irritable they didn't even want to come downstairs and eat breakfast with the thought you saiders. They tried to solve the problem by not speaking to the children, but of course the telephone rang and Mrs. Burbank said, "Allison, answer the phone," and Allison didn't move, and her father said, "Answer the phone," and Allison said, "Oh, answer the phone. I thought you said this ham's got a bone." Darcy said, "I thought you said the dances are home." Bard said, "I thought you said, the jam's all alone." It was the last straw. Mr. Burbank said, "This nonsense has got to stop now. I'm not going to eat another meal with the thought you saids." As soon as the children had left for school, and even before she washed the breakfast dishes, Mrs. Burbank decided she must do something about the thought you saiders. She poured herself another cup of coffee and sat down at the breakfast table and thought and thought. Oh boy, the dog came and sat down beside her, and she gave him a small piece of ham and stroked his head and wondered what to do. She was just going to call Mr. Burbank's mother when the telephone rang again. Mrs. Burbank answered it. It was Mrs. Pigglewiggle, and she wanted the children to come for tea. Mrs. Burbank said, "Oh, Mrs. Pigglewiggle, I'm so delighted that you called. I was just sitting here at the breakfast table wondering what in the world to do." And so she told Mrs. Pigglewiggle about the thought you saiders. Mrs. Pigglewiggle told her, There is a regular epidemic of thought-you-said-itis all over town. It really is a very harmless disease, but can be most annoying to parents, especially when they are trying to hurry. I have suffered with it myself this past week. Put on your shoes is thought you said sat on a fuse. Get me a tack is thought you said butter on a cracker, and on and on. Fortunately, there is a cure, and it's very simple. I have a magic powder which you sprinkle in the children's ears tonight. It will make their hearing so keen that they'll be able to hear spiders stamping across the floor, leaves crashing to the ground, flowers snapping open their petals, and fireflies striking the matches that light their lanterns. I must warn you that tomorrow when the children are wearing the magic hearing powder, you mustn't pop corn, run the vacuum cleaner, or serve dry, crunchy breakfast foods. The noise will be too painful for them. I'll send the powder over with the children when the children stop by after school. You might lend a little to Marilyn's mother. Goodbye and good luck. Mrs. Pigglewiggle hung up the phone. After school, the children came rushing in to deliver the package for Mrs. Pigglewiggle and to change their clothes. Mrs. Pigglewiggle's package contained a tiny little box of white powder. Mrs. Burbank felt the powder and smelled it. It felt like talcum powder, and it smelled like ginger. She put it under a pile of clean handkerchiefs in her handkerchief box. That evening, after the children were in bed, she told Mr. Burbank about it. He thought the magic powder sounded wonderful and decided to try a little in his own ears. Mrs. Burbank went up and got the bottle, and Mr. Burbank put a pinch in his left ear. Immediately, he shouted, "Turn off that terrible radio! It's killing me!" Mrs. Burbank rushed and turned off the radio. Mr. Burbank said, "It's thundering. We must be going to have a storm." Mrs. Burbank listened. She couldn't hear any thunder. She opened the front door and went out and looked at the sky. It was clear, dark blue and spangled with stars. The night was still quiet as a picture. Mr. Burbank shouted, "The storm's getting closer, almost overhead now." Mrs. Burbank came in and closed the door. She said, "Bernard Burbank, it's a cold, clear, perfectly peaceful night. There is no thunder." Mr. Burbank said, "Listen, don't you hear it? Deafening. That's what it is, deafening." Mrs. Burbank listened carefully. Then she heard from the kitchen a very soft, faint, thumping noise. She went out to investigate and found Old Boy, the dog, lying under the kitchen table, scratching and bumping his elbow on the floor. She gave Old Boy a dog biscuit and put him out. Then she went back to the living room and asked Mr. Burbank if the storm had passed. He said, "Do you have to stamp your feet like that? You certainly must be getting fat. You sound like a coal truck when you walk." I'm telling you right now, if my husband said that to me, Mrs. Burbank, who was very slight, looked down at her soft red house slippers and said, "Bernard, I think you had better wash the magic powder out of your ears, because I'm going to go out right now and get some graham crackers and think of the torture you'll go through if I drop a crumb." Mr. Burbank said, "Stop shouting." Mrs. Burbank said, "I'm whispering, dear." So Mr. Burbank went upstairs to wash out his ear. When he snapped on the light in the bathroom, he flinched because it sounded like a pistol shot. When he turned on the faucet, it sounded like Niagara Falls, and he accidentally brushed a hairpin off the windowsill, and it sounded like a huge iron chain crashing to the floor. Mr. Burbank filled the bathroom glass with warm water. He decided that the best way to be to wash out the magic powder. He would just pour some in his ear when from behind... What in the world? Pour some in his ear. When from behind the bathtub, he heard the most awful screaming, screeching, whining noise. He straightened up, put down the glass, and peered over the bathtub. He didn't see anything. He bent down over the basin again and picked up the glass. He was just about to pour the warm water in his ear when the horrible screaming, squealing noise came again, this time right by his head. Mr. Burbank was so scared he dropped the glass, spilled the water, and banged his head on the faucet. He looked all around but couldn't see anything. The noise came again, this time a little fainter, from behind the Venetian blind. He raised the blind and looked carefully. He couldn't see a thing. The terrible noise came again, this time by the mirror. Then Mr. Burbank saw what it was, a big mosquito. He grabbed a washcloth and, without thinking of his magic hearing, swatted the mosquito. The screams of agony that immediately filled the bathroom were horrible. Mr. Burbank hurriedly turned on the warm water and stuck his ear right underneath the faucet. Whew, what a relief. He picked the dead mosquito up by one leg and put it in the wastebasket, and then he called Mrs. Burbank. "Hey, Mary, I'm all right now, but I think we better go easy with that magic powder in the children's ears. It's awfully strong." Mrs. Burbank said, "Perhaps you used too much. Here, I'll measure it out. I'll use a toothpick, and I'll just put a grain or so in the right ear of each child. Come on now, come help me." They tiptoed into the children's room and put a toothpick full of magic powder in each one's ear. Even in his sleep, Darcy was saying, "Miss Anderson, I didn't hear you say hand me that ruler. I thought you said bananas are cooler." Mr. and Mrs. Burbank looked at their sleeping son and then at each other. "Just wait until tomorrow, Darcy, old boy," said Mr. Burbank. That next morning at 7 o'clock, Bard came running into his parents' room and said, Mommy, Daddy, there's a terrible noise in our room. It sounds like sawing. Mr. and Mrs. Burbank got out of bed, put on their robes, and went in to investigate. They couldn't hear a thing. Darcy said, Isn't that an awful noise, Daddy? Do you think it's a buzz bomb? Mr. and Mrs. Burbank looked and looked, but they couldn't see or hear anything. Mr. Burbank told the children to get dressed and come down to breakfast. Bard began to cry. He said, Well, come down, Daddy, but if you don't have... We'll come down, Daddy, but you don't have to yell at us. Mr. Burbank said in a very quiet whisper, Your hearing must be very good this morning. I didn't yell. In fact, I almost whispered. Then he said, Exactly where is the boy's buzzing noise coming from, Darcy? Listen carefully and tell me. Darcy said, Right there, by the curtain. Mr. Burbank pulled back the curtain and found a very small fly buzzing and buzzing in a corner of a window. Remembering his experience with the mosquito, he didn't dare swat the fly, so he opened the window, unlatched the screen, and pushed the fly off the windowsill. It flew happily away. Darcy said, Daddy, I can't stand this awful crunching noise my shoelaces make when I put them through the holes. It sounds like bones breaking. Mr. Burbank said, Here, I have an idea. He tied his handkerchief around Darcy's head like a bandage. This'll fix it. Whistle biscuit, Darcy said. I thought you said whistle biscuit. His father jerked the handkerchief off and said, Hurry down to breakfast. At breakfast, Allison said, Oh, Mother, I can't stand the sound of you buttering that toast. It sounds like hoeing on cement. Bart said, Hoeing on cement? I thought you said, He took a spoonful of oatmeal and never finished the sentence. A piece of toast popped out of the toaster. All three children jumped. Darcy said, Mother, you should warn us when you're going to make so much noise. Mrs. Burbank said, I'm sorry, but it didn't seem loud to me. I guess my ears aren't very good. Allison said, Come on, boys, let's go to school. Darcy said, I thought you said poison. I thought you said poison. I don't know what I thought you meant. Allison said, Old boy's breathing so loud I can't hear a thing. And does he have to splash his tongue around in his mouth like that, Mother? Mrs. Burbank called Old Boy and gave him a piece of bacon. She snapped and gulped, and all three children jumped and shuddered. What a noise, said Allison, glaring at the poor dog. He's just like some terrible kind of jungle beast. Mrs. Burbank said, Come on, children, put on your coats and go to school. Allison said, Spit on your coats. I thought you said spit on your coats. Nobody laughed. Darcy said, Don't talk so loud, Allison. It hurts my ears. Bard said, Didn't you hear what Mother said? She didn't say spit on your coats. She said put on your coats. Allison said, I know. I can hear. Let's go. The front door closed quietly, and Mrs. Burbank said to her husband, who was groping for the sugar, That's the first time in 5 years that they have not banged that door. Here's the sugar, dear, and you have 4 minutes before the next bus. Just then, the front door opened and the three children came crying into the house. Allison said, Mother, we just can't stand it. The sidewalk is covered with leaves, and when we walk through, the noise is so dreadful, you just can't bear it. It sounds like hundreds of giants chopping wood. Bart said, It sounds like millions of paper bags. Darcy said, It sounds like thousands of houses burning up. Crackle, crackle, crash. Mrs. Burbank said, Well, Bernard, I think we'd better wash their ears out, and we'll give Mrs. Pigglewiggle our heartiest thanks. Mr. Burbank said, What's she done wrong? Who? Said Mrs. Burbank. Mrs. Pigglewiggle, said Mr. Burbank. What are you talking about? Said Mrs. Burbank. I said that we should give Mrs. Pigglewiggle our heartiest thanks. Oh, said Mr. Burbank. I thought you said go give Mrs. Pigglewiggle your hardest spanks. The children looked disgusted. Tomorrow, the tattle cure. Have a great day, guys.